we're gonna start the discussion session. Can you?
Yep. You got the slide? Yep. So we asked, I think, hopefully most people saw, our wrangler might not have done it, but we asked some questions, or we asked people if they had questions. And Vicky's got a slide here with these questions, so we thought more general discussion certainly can happen, people have the endurance, but we should address for the people who are good enough to questions in play.
And some of the questions, Jacob submitted a question, and people have been trying to incorporate it where they could into their presentations.
All right, good. So are these individual people, each bullet point, or is this one person?
Just the questions. No, I compiled all of the, so there's these questions and then Jacob's question. And then if you send a question after yesterday at 12 p.m., I didn't get it because I haven't had access to email.
So I think on the first one, probably Garnett's presentation spoke a fair bit about the use of 3D at a number of levels, a number of different types of surveys, and Garrett, of course, just signed off on that with his. So I guess the thing is that although in that case the DS is a direct resistivity imaging, it's not EM, but similar things apply. Is there anything, Garnet, that you would? I mean, did it take you long to build it in the system? I mean, is it? I mean, you've got your capacity within Chemical. Obviously, you've spent time and effort to build that. But if people were to sort of like, you know, is it Uber modeling? Do you just call them up and they'll?
And as I tried to state during the presentation, it's not so much the targeting criteria that we base our targeting off of right now. The 3D image, that's still based on conductor picks, but it helps us prioritize our conductor picks and maybe understand the geometry of the conductive stratigraphy better. Whether it's correlated one-to-one to again, the structure and the trap, that is probably in too much detail with the 3D image versions at this time. But it is a step ahead of just the conventional profile interpretation of 1D versions.
There's still, well, we do this as part of our business, and there's certainly data density is an issue. When you go to these inversions, if you have to be cognizant of that because not all surveys are created equally. One advantage generally of the airborne is that they have a degree of consistency that makes it reasonably good fodder to put into inversion programs. Although it was mentioned that the challenges with gravity gradiometry in particular, the gradiometry is inherently sensitive to the near surface. So if that surface is heterogeneous because of drumlins, topography, these things require attention. And Claire mentioned in her modeling inversion of the seismic data, you're always going to need more than one kick of the cat. It becomes a, and I think when we chatted a couple of months ago about this, it was like Garnet, you said that the seismic data, it's like having an in-law move in with you. They're never going to leave, right? But they're going to give something back. They're going to take care of the kids, right? If you behave yourself. But some of these data sets just aren't just a one-trick pony. You get more out of them. You can put more in. I mean, we use this term constraint in a loose way, but if you can effectively understand how to put that back into the modeling, you can actually then get another iteration back out. On the whole, but I don't say the whole system is biased against it, but the people like in government want a new survey. It's like they want more money to be spent because that often seems to be the tangible way to add value to properties is to do yet again another survey. Dave loves that. But sometimes it's building on the data you already have. and improving it. And, you know, it will reach its limit at some point, but we'll probably, many of these could go far longer in time than they're allowed to, because, and then, yeah, anyways, that's and these inversions, I mean, the DIAS, you know, hats off to them for being the first ones to push out such a large data set, but it certainly challenged the part of the service industry that works with those data to actually be able to produce the models. And you're getting computing problems here that are probably approaching, in a way, what the seismic industry had to deal with maybe 20 years ago when they started doing 3D seismic. And of course, the other thing that they do is they do it in real time. It's none of this bullshit of waiting 3 months. That's like assays in minerals, right? Everybody's having to wait all this time to get assays. In the oil industry, you've got a drill that's costing you $1 million a day. You are guiding that drill with information from a survey taken the day before. It's imperative that the turnaround be there. We have no capability of reaching quite that level in the minerals industry, and yet it's probably coming with the tube drilling, the lab at the rake sort of things. You've probably heard of this, the DET CRC efforts in Australia. They'll have these very, well, hopefully cost-effective ways of testing targets that are going to be, I think they're shooting for $50 a meter. That's the figure I heard them coming up with, that they're going to be able to generate a sample of the Earth at $50 a meter and analyze it at the rake itself. Real-time turnaround. So if we have modeling that goes with it, it's going to have to be in junction. There's no point, if you're 3 months afterwards, everybody, that train is going to be gone by the time you get back with your model. Nobody's going to care. So. Filtering things out. I think we're supposed to be the filter, aren't we? What? Yeah. Comment on the possible methods to filter out anomalies. So you want to downgrade them. You want to turn the uglies into bads or something and reject them. I guess, is that the false positives? That's another term that we sometimes throw out. Things that look what you want. But as Garrett examples showed quite well in sort of a group, I mean, it's not often we have, like, how many zones? There must be 30 different individual zones of mineralization along that corridor. Well, if you add all the little, you know, the 3 guys up at the northwest end or northeast end and everything, you had about 6 or 7 on the PLS ground.
If you have the separate things that have been joined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like Triple R was originally like 6 or 7, but now it's 1.
Oh, okay, all right. But if you go back to the V10 Acthouse and the bright spots, the number of places that are near, that are associated with mineralization, there's probably 7 or 8, right?
Yeah.
But how many are false positives? I mean, it's not likely that every one of them is mineralized. I mean, it could be, but I mean, how do you filter those out? Isn't that what the role of drilling is supposed to perform? I guess, or
Again, if I may, one thing that I want to throw in a little observation here. One of the things is you can't rely on one survey, right? We keep talking about the fact that you can't rely on one survey to do the work for you. So rather than trying to, in some ways, filter out, which I showed a little bit of example of ways you could theoretically filter out some anomalies in one type of data modeled in several different ways, but it's also the flip concept of if you've got 4 different surveys and you've got cool things about each one, things that are exciting about within each one, and you take those pieces themselves and then start layering them on top of each other. Where they stack, that's better evidence than those by themselves, right? So instead of just thinking about filtering out anomalies, it's the idea of stacking anomalies. Figuring out where do all these things land on top of each other, giving you more confidence about one area over another.
Right.
So I think it's a related question. Yes, we could find some ways of filtering, but it's also important to make sure we understand that what we're modeling and what we're deciding to focus on are actually valid to whatever model it is that we're following, knowing that we always have to adapt our models to what we learn.
And I thought that Arrow, what Garrett presented on Arrow was exactly that. He stacked data set and said basically it was pretty easy to choose this spot because the data stacked beautifully.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
key.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to say.
yeah, some, you know, is I think you'd say that some of those you actually have a reasonably clear idea why they're in the story, like the graphite. There's a definition why it's there. A mag gradient is a little more subtle, because mag gradients are there are a lot of mag gradients out there. We can generate, if you don't have enough, we can generate more.
Well, but that's my point. But if you've got a mag gradient,
They all stack.
so you've got a mag gradient, you've got a graphitic conductor, you've also got some sort of geochemical anomalies like a lake sediment or some of the radiometric stuff that I was showing, but you've got all those landing on exactly the same spot. And you've got that in like 4 locations relative to the 30 that you potentially could have in one of those surveys alone. Well, that reduces the number of targets you're going to spend your time looking at.
Well, and what you're getting to, the next step, and people are doing this, is like a prospectivity analysis where there's a weighting attached to this, because some components are going to weight more than others. You may be present, but it's like the AGC. Not everything should be treated equally, because
Agreed.
it can dominate it and say, the mag looks so big, and yet really what you're looking for is so small. So yeah, it's going down that road.
But it also, what you're speaking to is also the idea of weighting it appropriately. I mean, there were some examples where people were actually showing up one mag. I think Colin may have actually shown one of these early on too, where you have a map at one scale, and then you flip your scale. You change your scale to focus in on a smaller window. And you keep doing that, depending on the scale of your map, or you decide, you know what, I don't care about a mag value above this, so now I'm going to scale it within that short window, rather than using my entire range of data. I chop off what I don't need. And you start looking at more detailed information across a shorter spectra, if you know what I mean. But it's basically trying to see more detail within something that's, potentially, if you try to look at everything, you go nuts. But if you start breaking out pieces you know are valuable, then you have a better chance of seeing something.
Ken,
Yo,
I'm not sure who would have asked this question, but certainly you just touched on prospectivity mapping. When I saw that question up there, I was thinking, well, you've got 2 end members here. You have pure inductive query, which would be the SOM approach, self-organized mapping, or the heat maps that the CEMIC group is generating. That's, to me, for all intents and purposes, taking all your layers, all your data, and just layering and seeing how it all comes up. Pure inductive query. Whereas deductive method is more what Don is speaking to, where you have a model that you're tying it to, taking all your data, you commented on weighting, so you're weighting the empirical parts of your model to the different data sets, and then testing it, and so there's those 2 approaches. There's that purely inductive SOM, heat map, or the more classic prospectivity map, the fuzzy logic approaches that people use. But you need to have a hypothesis to tie the data to. You may have several models that you're following, but you still have to weight the data to those models. So I'm not sure if that's what that person might be looking for. Because you guys talk about filters with your data,
right.
but that's a single set of data.
Monotonic usually it is, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there are methods out there. It's a bit how you and some groups, we're running I'm involved with the DMEC group that ran the 17 conference a couple of weeks ago. We're doing a workshop at the next PDAC on AI and big data approaches, and this is sort of another one of these. It's a large thing coming in or passing by, and how we attach ourselves to it is an interesting question, because much of what I see AI being applicable for, and I'm trying to learn as I go along with this, as well as put this workshop together, is you need things that are reasonably well posed problems, because it's like listening to cell phone conversations on 100 million phones to find 2 or 3 conversations that are about a bomb that's going to go off in some country somewhere, right? They can do those analysis very well, but right now, if you put Watson up against a minerals exploration problem, it works on downstream issues where there's a lot of robust information about mining and milling, but you bring it up into our ephemeral world where we still don't really know why deposits are there. We can do vectoring, we can put smart people on the problem. We wonder whether that is going to have the breakthrough. And my spy inside Goldcorp, and they've been becoming fairly closely attached to IBM, their comment is that we've got a long ways to go. my colleague was doing a similar thing with Rio Tinto, said, we thought we'd put all of the Hammersley data into the AI program and see what came out. You know what the problem was? You know what they found? Their data was rat shit. All the 30 years or 40 years of accumulated data, nobody had thought about standards for assaying, for logging, for geological descriptions. It was just layers on top of, it was like like going into a house and there'd been 10 people living there, and all of their stuff was just stacked on top. And that's he says, so when we finished, he says, we had a great database. Whether we actually thought we had enough energy to then apply the AI program, he says, was another matter. They're going for a new survey, by the way. That's the bottom. They dropped their gravity gradiometer and they're apparently going to fly Falcon. So yeah, Don, you see it.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt you. So
No.
I put my hand up, but AI is interesting, but it requires the HI first, right? The human intelligence before the artificial, because we still see a lot of examples of people taking the map that's been delivered by the geophysical contractor and using that. Not doing anything to it, not even trying to interrogate it. There's, just because it's delivered in a certain format, as a certain PDF document, you have all the data that's behind that available to you as well, where you can start questioning it. You can start playing around with different ratios, you can start creating different contrasts. But that one map you have that's been delivered doesn't mean that that's the end product. And I haven't seen as much as this whole thing is, in some ways, I think it's important to kind of understand that everybody who's a geologist has an opportunity to go and interrogate the data themselves. If you want help, there's people to help, sure, but there's also the opportunity for you to think about it. And that's not just random dumping out of stuff, it's thinking about the problem. So, and there's lots of data out there. It's amazing how much free data there is.
Yeah.
To test it, to try it. So, just that HI is, I think we need to get that HI caught up before we start going to the AI.
Well, there was one on that point that I heard some years ago. The oil industry has some different approaches to this from what I can understand. And one of the things that a colleague of mine, John Gingrich, worked at in the late 90s and early 2000s was looking at what a group called Pete Rose and Associates had done for risk assessment inside the petroleum industry. And there's certainly some analogies inside, the uranium business and drilling deep oil is an expense. But a large part of the problem wasn't we were trying to manage success, it was trying to manage failure. And they reversed the problem. Because most freaking geoscientists and minerals are such lunatics when it comes to optimism. They always think the next one's going to be the ore hole. No, it's not. It never is. It just doesn't happen that way. And yet the evidence just doesn't believe by people. You love the optimism, but in the boardrooms of the oil companies back in the mid-90s, they said, bullshit, this is enough. We're spending far too much money and not getting what we should be getting. And so they figured out ways to actually break the problem down to reduce the risk. And so they started, as John said, at that point, Noranda had a chunk of her owned Canadian Hunter. And he says, they've got a 90% plus success rate in drilling. He says, we're not on the same planet. We can't have discussions with these people. They think we're idiots. Now, of course, the thing is, not the old farts that we remember, the oil companies jumped into the minerals game in the 70s and 80s with this paradigm that they could transform the minerals business into something that was as easy as the oil exploration by applying seismic and other high power techniques. Didn't work out too well for them. So maybe some of the advantages they have is because seismic, and we only had one talk today from Claire about it, is so powerful at defining the environments that host oil. It's so much more powerful than any of the other techniques. We have to, as Don said, rely on the Venn diagram or the heat map approach and try and stack all this stuff up. And then we get the sheep bones and we throw those down and look at the runes. And then we go home and talk to our dog, and then we decide what we're going to do with the drilling program. This is really top-notch science that we have. Sir, Garner, yes.
Sorry, and I don't mean to pull this away from the AI aspect, but we can't forget about geology. And one of the big things about working in the basin for a long time is the styles of mineralization and the mineral deposits themselves are so varied. There's not one deposit that's alike. And the next big discovery is likely not going to be the same as the previous discovery. So when you talk about filtering out anomalies related to the deposits, be careful, because it's likely going to be different, right? Common factor, source rocks, transport, trap, and preservation.
Yeah. And quantifying that to get it into an AI box is pretty challenging. Yeah. So say the geo. So. Okay. Point three. One of the things I didn't mention in the Yukon example, the lines were a kilometer. Okay. You were able to map effectively that basin with lines that are 2.5 times what we normally consider standard issue here in the basin. That has enormous implications as far as cost and doability. The Geoscience BC people didn't go out to a kilometer, but I don't think they used 400 meters. It was still like a...
There were 2 kilometers and 5 kilometers.
Was it in the Quinnell Trough?
Then...
That was the first survey, yeah. And they were doing it, yeah, that's right, okay. So that's a magnetotellurics in Australia where they're doing a lot of ground MT. I think it's in large part because they have they're vexed by a lot more near surface connectivity in the saprolite, in the laterite, and you know where that comes from, right? That connectivity. When I worked in Australia, we still used to think it was the weathering. Well, it's not the weathering. It's salt from the Indian Ocean. It's basically rained down on the continent for millennia, and it's impregnated the upper part of the soil, and it's a huge problem for agriculture because when the Europeans came in 150 years ago or so, they started putting fresh water in, and that basically is bringing the salt up. Huge amounts of their arable land have now been sterilized by salt that has been in their ground all the time. So MT for minerals exploration is probably more appropriate. Plus, they want to probably put a bathtub, call it, down to 15, 20 kilometers. How many of you have seen that iconic picture of Olympic Dam? Actually, Colin had a shot that was, okay, he's seen it. So you have the little thermos that's Olympic Dam, but big honking deposit. This goes down with seismic and MT to 40 plus kilometers in the earth. And they're looking at this giant seismic disturb zone that they think is the alteration that was associated as the fluids came through to form that minerals deposit. So this isn't going down, a kilometer and a half. That's your mining depth. Your exploration depth, your thought depth has to be 5 times that depth. So you need data. Our mag is good. The gravity's good. Z10 would give us information down to, our record is just around 2 kilometers in a good environment, and this basin is a pretty good environment. But if you're serious about it, I talked, you know Graham Begg? He's a nickel guy, black rock guy. But he's the guy that thinks about hotspots that form, like Norilsk and the traps. And he was at the PDAC a couple of years ago, and I said, hey, the basin is interesting. It's still very prospective. But how do we crack this egg open? Assemble the thousands of assessment data sets? Keep, am I busy for the next 30 years? He says, no. He says, just run some transects. He says, run some MT across the basin, cover the whole thing, even Alberta, and start putting your 3D models together.
We're trying.
Yeah,
I know.
I have to say, I'm pretty jealous of that data set in South Australia, because I think we are missing, this is not going to necessarily direct exploration, direct targeting, but it's going to tell us where the deeply rooted parts of this basin are. And I think if you're going to have a big epigenetic mineral system, you need that deep rooting. And the thing at Olympic Dam, it's a huge anomaly right into the mantle.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Would allow you to take ownership.
Surprising as well.
Yeah.
Given the size of that deposit.
So wider line spacing at I mentioned this morning, or no, this afternoon, we actually ended up with lines that would normally be considered suboptimal. It's a pretty flexible technique. A lot of it's been used for things like porphyry coppers. Some work has been done in Nevada. But the basin stuff, to me, has been probably the most impressive in terms of showing geology that's, I said earlier, complementary to the, certainly to the mag. And the last point, I think I just said to Vicki, I said, well, you know, you've got all the major contractors here, they can tap them on the shoulder. It's not really the part of the story that we, I mean, everything's about, you know, when you need it done, how much, what technology you need to use. I'm sure, you know, that the discoveries and DSs and Abitibi's, et cetera, would all be very happy to answer those questions. It's a very temporal thing, you know, depends on, do you have snow? You have to walk through the water. So, yeah, I'll just skip it now.
This is Jacob's question.
Right, it came out during the discussion. So what do we, it's the number of surveys submitted? It's not the number of kilometers. Is that
Number of surveys,
number of surveys submitted?
based on year.
Okay.
In the assessment files.
Right.
That looks like one of Richard Shoddy's pictures. Right? Where's the bucks? Where's the money? Well, just this is how many surveys can get done, right? That's cool, I like that.
But the point that I was trying to make is that if you just look at the historics of like magnetic surveys in Saskatchewan from the assessment reports all the way up until like 2015, you see like the 70s and 80s, there's just around 40% of all the surveys were connected then. So can we not just go back to those surveys and reprocess them using new software, using new understanding of the geology and the variability that changes the magnetic susceptibility and things like that? Can we not just revisit that instead of trying out new surveys?
Well, they actually, for the basin, they have a new survey. Vicki mentioned, you know, the GSC and Saskatchewan.
They've done quite a few new ones.
And
But
then,
the issue is we don't have any digital data here from that big spike. That's the issue. It'd be great to go back to it, but
and the location
I imagine
information
that
would be
some
pretty
Cameco might have
positive.
some of that original data.
Plus
I don't
data
know.
quality is a
Yeah.
big factor too.
Well, you'd have to assess that, but we don't have the data in our files. It's not there.
Can we not, does Cameco still have some of that raw data that we could ask them?
I'm not sure.
Well, the other part of the story that I would personally predict is that the vast majorities of those surveys would be on top of a highway that probably had an EM feature associated with it. So you would have no background, you would have no contextual information to refer to. You would have all of these postage stamps along this axis or axes. So you would have location information, you have extreme spatial bias, you would have the issues, as Dave said, about quality, that, you know, and this is still an area that the government see as pre-competitive research. They'll go out and spend the money to acquire this, data sets like this. I think they should spend a bit more for some other stuff.
Yeah.
But they said, with Vicki and your team coming out, they're coming back. I mean, Charlie Jefferson was here a decade ago, and I guess Eric did some work, maybe yourself, but it had kind of a hiatus, and they seem to be coming back and looking at it.
There was they somehow negotiated a few $100,000 a year for geophysical surveys over a period, and they flew quite a number of mag radiometric surveys in that time. Then they ended up losing the money, as sometimes happens. But because of cost of various other surveys, they always fall back on the cheapest ones, typically because you can cover the most ground. And at this point in the basin, that's probably not the way to go anymore. But you have to change the way you think about your investment and how much you can get done. And like I say, I'm a big fan of the MT idea. And I'd love to see gravity too, better gravity, but it's a lot of money. And I can tell you the province of Saskatchewan doesn't have a lot of money right now for this type of thing.
Well, maybe it needs to be a criteria in the Fraser rankings, right?
But this is the thing. This is a good point, because if there's some momentum generated from industry that this might be useful, then all of a sudden people start paying attention.
Well, then the
And,
government
yeah.
finds money.
That's
People
just
put
it,
pressure
yeah.
on them, they they find money.
So we're not telling you to make trouble, but I mean, if there's something that industry sees as valuable, there are people that will actually listen to you, that are probably right here in this building right now. So it is important to have that feedback to the SMA or whomever that what might be useful that the public might be able to support. And these type of surveys, I don't think should be funded by industry, quite frankly. They're public data sets that we need to have.
Yeah, they're pre-competitive.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And they should be acquired and put in the hands of universities and governments.
Right.
And our best brains, young brains coming into the business should be looking at those and telling us what they think. And the old guard should be there to mentor those people, to help guide them with all the knowledge that they've extracted over the years. You say, well, you could go down to Regina and spend 2-3 weeks going through the filing cabinets to get a start, or you could talk to Bob and he'll tell you, what you need to know in this particular area. But Bob's not going to be around that much longer. That's the problem.
I think one thing with the old surveys is that if you find a drill hole and it's in the middle of nowhere, it's very often you drill with a reason. And not understanding usually in the basic seems it's geophysical. So it's very easy to access the data that is digital. Some of it, like the megaton and geotem surveys, cover very large areas of EM. Often there's ground EM following those up and then there's a drill hole sitting there. So if you're investigating a property and there's prior work on it, I mean, you shouldn't stop at looking at the drill log, you should look at the data that preceded it as well. And that digital data is pretty fast to access and pretty easy to work with. The other stuff that's just on paper or scans of paper maps can take us, there can be a big cost associated with the time of getting access to it. You should certainly look at the digital stuff.
Over a decade of digital data, I would think now. It's getting to be a big database, yeah. But Dave.
I'm just going to challenge your comments on the MT, okay?
MT, not this is that
No, MT.
Okay.
Absolute wonderful information coming out of the Gower Craton in South Australia. But that is craton and crustal skin.
Yep.
That's not what industry needs in the Athabasca Basin. We know the Athabasca Basin is by far the most fertile uranium terrain on the globe right now, from our knowledge. We have world-class deposits on the eastern side. We now have them on the western side with Arrow and Triple R. So we know we have uranium from the north to the south and the east to the west. We don't need to understand the crustal prospectivity of the Athabasca Basin from an industry's targeting, look at where in the basin we want to be. It's everywhere. I would say MT survey, you've got to think on the provincial scale, where should you be doing that? Not in a fertile terrain like the Athabasca Basin, but some other terrain that we want to promote, we want to better understand. So, I agree, we can get all excited about the MT in South Australia, but...
Well, they're doing it, the one I was mentioning was WA actually, the iconic picture came from.
Okay.
Yeah, there's one, but there is one in Gawler, yeah.
No.
Yeah,
But I think
Graham has talked to us, he's been to our office, he's
Right.
talked, it's exciting stuff, the
Right.
scale he thinks. He's thinking of deep crust upper mantle processes, and it's all exciting. But if we're talking about the Athabasca Basin, I don't believe that's the place to do it. It's good for the academics.
I think, yeah, the part that I think of, Dave, that sits there is that gnaws at me is the time. To me, you're living in a house with 10 rooms and you know 3 of them reasonably well, and you're aware there's 2 others, but the rest of it, you don't have ownership of it. It's not really yours, and that's when you can say the basin is actually a real entity. In a way, to me, it's in doing that sooner than later allows people to strategize. I mean, that was the thing that Dan Wood said about, the curse that we have is the time it takes to get through cycles. We're expecting infinite patience on the part of the companies that support us, the investors that put up money. And we clearly see they are running out of patience, and yet there's nothing really that we're doing to bootstrap this along. We're doing really good work, but but we're going to have to get another survey, and we can't do that for 6 months. And this is something which I think we have an opportunity to step change this if we have the right sort of data sets.
So do you think just do it, like, we're talking that scale, like I'm focusing on right
Yeah.
now is the scale of MT surveys, big regional
Yeah,
surveys
big regional.
across the basin. And what Graham says, transects across the basin, is that really gonna help industry? Look for the, understand the other room, as you put it, in the basin.
Well, would you go out to, I mean, I don't know if it's negotiable or not, but Lake Athabasca itself covers a big part.
Absolutely, I wouldn't drill up there, it's too challenging, but we know on the other side of the lake, at Maurice Bay,
Right.
we have uranium mineralization, unconformity type
Yeah.
uranium mineralization. There, we have uranium mineralization all along the north rim. We have Fond du Lac deposit, we have, the Black Lake.
Uranium City sits there with its,
We can make links with Uranium City. It's great for understanding, but it is the most fertile uranium part of the crust that we're in the entire globe. So the MT survey is great, we can get on the bandwagon and say, yeah, we need to do this stuff. Is that the place to do it? I think the challenge is finding the new terrains to do those types of surveys. That's what I'm throwing.
well, I mean, part of this too, in a way, is sort of listening to people that talk about the people that we need the support of, whether they're investors or the people at large. And if you don't show you're taking ownership of your problem, the assumption is you don't want to have ownership of the problem, that somebody else is going to take ownership. The government will decide as to what's going to be best for you. So if industry says, well, it actually isn't necessary for us to do that, but investors are going to say, well, if you don't have your act together, if you're not telling me, if you're not an articulate cheerleader for why you're in a particular area. I mean, Doug Silver, I don't know if you know, how many of you know Doug. Doug's he's got the largest database of mineral discoveries going back to Babylonian times. That was one of the first things he did. He's a geologist, used to work for Anaconda. Then he started a royalty company, which he sold and made about $300 or $400 million on. Now he works for a group called Orion Investors. And he came up and he gave a talk at the Alaskan Open House I was at a couple of weeks ago. And he had like 12 slides. It was the most important 12 slides given at the frickin' conference. One of the first things he says was, you guys, you people collectively in Alaska have got your native rights issues together. He says, your problem is you're being judged by what happens in Canada, which he says is chaos. This is an American guy talking. He says, my company is prepared to put $500 million into 4 opportunities a year. And he says, if there's one rotten orange in that barrel, he says, we walk away. He says, right now you're rotten orange up at Pebble. He says, you Google Alaska and you Google mining, and it's Pebble issues. He says, you've got a great story on the native rights because all the land is owned. It's all settled for an agreement dates back to the early 70s. He says, your problem is you don't promote it. Just people don't know. The guys in Frankfurt, the guys in New York don't know that the native rights issues between Alaska and, say, Canada, it's just because most of the companies coming up to work in Alaska are Canadian juniors. They figured they're bringing their problem along. Then the other thing was, he said, the people judging, he says, we have these 4 opportunities a year, and he says, if there's one thing we don't like, we just turn on hail. But if you can demonstrate you actually have ownership of your geological problem, of your terrain, of your ideas, they will see that as being a positive thing. And that's just saying, it seems to be the world that, it's no longer the strong Norandas or, the Kevels are backing the bets. It's people back from them. They're the ones going cap in hand to these people as well for funds to make developments. So I think that Dave, it has a, and I think Australia really is collectively, they're scared, crap scared out of it, because they see that the funding is dropping. It's coming back up a bit now in gold, but they're probably like here, they're visiting mostly known occurrences. There's very little grassroots work being done. And so they're trying to get, with their, very sophisticated geoscience institutions, some information into the hands. They can start to try and understand you've seen Cam McQuaig's talk about the Yilgarn and the yttrium anomaly and boundaries and stuff like that. I've never seen anybody in Canada do that. Maybe CIMIC did this at some point. The problem is they were looking at deposits. Whereas the CET group, UWA, were looking at the entire Yilgarn and saying, I want to take ownership of the terrain.
They're looking at crustal scale benches.
Right.
So I'm just challenging, go to a crustal scale area that's already endowed. The challenge is, where are you gonna look within that area? That's the real challenge. And I wondered if
Well,
MT
yeah.
profiles really do it. The Thelon Basin, absolutely, I would transect that one and say, do you see anything unusual underneath the Thelon?
Yeah.
That's where I would.
Well, I would think that I'm more worried about a couple decades down the road when we're looking for the next really big deposit. Is there somewhere we missed that we might see with a survey like that? But your points about other areas of the province is pretty important as well. Like, for example, I think there's probably a big gold deposit somewhere in the Ranger Zone, a really big one, and this might be a way to help focus people to where that is, something like that. So that is a valid point that we should be doing them elsewhere as well. Because you're right, we're looking for crustal scale features, no question about it.
That's what MT, but you did mention MT has improved a huge amount from 20 years ago. And we're doing MT in the Thelon. I don't know, Garrett, did we do MT in the basin? Yeah, Tabasco?
Yeah, I didn't show them,
Okay.
because I was emptied out on Reed Lake.
But
You didn't look at table one?
I saw those oldies, goodies, oldies on the table now.
Well, in the basin, because of the sandstone, there's something like the Z10, which would be far cheaper.
Yeah, so.
You could maybe do that and say, do that as an experiment and say that's kind of MT light, but it would, get you down at least 1 kilometer into the basement.
Yeah, and we're doing that. That George showed our Z10 from.
But do the whole tub.
We need to get credit for it.
Yeah, well, you would. So that's why
And Geotech actually has a platform that can do, it's a fixed wing, not a helicopter, but that can do the gravity and the Z10 concurrently. And they've flown it in a few places. So the technology, in many cases, it already exists. We just have to have a vision as to what value it can add. And then get the constituency together to build a story. So yeah, I think it's good, but the data sets there are challenged, I think. Okay, it's open. It doesn't have to be me. Questions with speakers from this morning, this afternoon?
Just for your own information, something you said a few minutes ago came up at the Key Open Forum at a previous World Petroleum Congress, which only occurs once every 4 years, about the frustration of trying to get something accomplished in Canada.
Yeah, people talk. People with money talk to each other. Yeah, if you can get Doug Silver to come to a meeting like this, it would be fun. He's one of those people that, he looks at the big trends. I can't think of actually anybody within the country that has that sort of bully pulpit. Richard Shoddy's good for the statistics, but he backs away from making interpretations as to the industry. He tends to be, if you know him, he's the guy that the PDAC hires to put stuff together, Quebec Department of Mines and stuff like that. He's very good. You can argue with his information because he does interpretations sometimes that are particularly on the geophysical discoveries. But anyways, he's a good statistician, but guys like Doug Silver actually have got themes, and they've got the position of, they know the industry very well, and they're in a very interesting place right now in terms of looking at all these opportunities. I don't know how many they look at a year. It's probably 40 or 50, and they really only put money into a few of them. So yeah. Are we done?
Any more questions?
We'll get the sticks organized. Oh yes, sir.
Sorry. Sampling gradients. Is it something that is still considered robust with reference to soil samplings or samplings from drill holes? Is it that detectors that are present are not sensitive enough to suggest a vector in terms of an economic gradient? Or is it because any good information has to come from a drill hole, which is very expensive to drill?
Don?
I would argue part of the problem is understanding background. So one of the comments I made about the downhole radiometrics, for instance, is a lot of it is based just on total counts, even on greenfield exploration. So there's absolutely no way being able to tell whether the CPS you're getting is related to what element, which one is it. So that was kind of the point of my talk at the end, was the idea that there are distinct signatures for uranium mineralization. There are ways of teasing those out, there's ways of ranking them and relatively doing it against a background. But you have to do the work, and you have to kind of come up with an overall idea of what your model is. And I know some people don't fully agree with my model, but I'm happy with it, and I'm working with it until it gets changed. But it does involve a certain amount of steps to come up with a signature that you can feel confident with. And I feel a lot more confident with that signature than I do with, say, using just a straight uranium ratio, a straight uranium count. So it's all about understanding what it is your goal is, like what do you want to identify, and understanding the context of it. So until you know all those pieces, you can't really apply any of the surveys without having those two pieces.
Thank you. Oh, yes, back.
Hi, Ken. I don't know how familiar people are with the Earthscope project. I'm not familiar enough with it, but there is a major initiative by Canadian university community to instigate a project along the lines of Earthscope to image a whole plethora of things. And it's actually David Eden at the University of Calgary is involved, and Catherine Boggs at Mount Royal University in Calgary. And yeah, anyway, the idea behind that is to have the next kind of lithoprobe style project, but it would involve, and it involves, as far as I understand it, a whole network of stations with very highly specialized measuring different signals, including seismic signals, which would eventually contribute to imaging deep crustal structures.
Maybe like the passive stuff that Claire was talking
Yeah,
about.
it's a passive network
Right.
that just takes signals as earthquakes occur, and then you're building up, you're a geophysicist, I'm not, but you're building up an image of deep crustal structures. But they're also doing other types of sensors, including atmospheric measurements, and all, it's really interesting.
Are people aware of the term Earthscope?
Yeah,
Right. It's in the States. It covers, my recollection is about a third of the northwestern, or third of the country in the northwestern part, and it's basically MT sounding sites. And I think there's literally at this point thousands of them. And it's basically, it's to do with earthquake hazard, volcanic hazard, part of the rationale, the basic crustal understanding. I mean, this is really regional data, but I've seen a number of workshops and things, people processing and interpreting these results to basically try and build up an understanding in the area, and then potentially to expand this out too. So it's interesting. I hadn't heard that there was a potential.
I wish I could speak to it more clearly, but it is a major initiative. They've been consulting with ANSWER. And they're at, I don't know, I think there's a workshop being held sometime in the new year, but I don't have the details.
All right, cool.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for coming. And
The stick should be there at our booth tomorrow, so we'll do that tonight.